book 6 into the analogy of the divided line. And here, Plato takes, they divide a line unequally, and then each of the two segments, they divide in the same ratio as the initial line. And there's some scholarly debate about exactly what this uneven division is and which parts of the line should we think of as the top and which is the bottom. So the diagram I have put up here makes the realm of true knowledge smaller than the bottom realm. I think we don't need to worry too much about that for our purposes. The thing to note, and we'll come back to, is that the one thing that's true on any interpretation, because you have those two unequal segments, and then they're each divided in the same ratio, then the two middle segments, so BC and CD, will be equal to each other. So the realm of thought, or dianoia, and the realm of belief or conviction, pistis, are the same size in this analogy. And that'll be relevant as we go. So we've got this divided line. As I said, is an analogy. It's really more of a diagram, but it brings out some features that weren't there in the analogy of the sun. And the first is this big contrast between the two realms. So the one segment of the line, the lower segment, is the realm of doxa, of mere opinion, I think would be a fair way to translate it. And it seems to be concerned with sensible or changeable being, with things that are familiar to us and what we're tempted to take as real. So it includes the very bottom segment is about images, acacia, shadows, reflections, and everything of that sort is how they describe it here. Here it seems to be appearances and images of the visible and natural world. We'll see the meaning seems to change a little bit when we get to the analogy of the cave. But here, at least initially, it's like the shadows of the trees that I see when I look outside, or other sort of appearances and reflections. And that's then contrasted with the natural perceptible beings that those things are shadows and reflections of. So the visible trees and houses and animals that we see around us. And I can have belief or conviction. I can have, those are two different ways of translating this word, pistis, about those visible things. So I have a conviction that it's sunny outside. I'm looking out my window. It looks fairly sunny and not rainy, but there are some clouds in the sky. Those are all items I have conviction about. But that's not enough for the kind of true tied down knowledge about things that really are. We only get that when we ascend up to the next level. So the next level, thought or dianoia, is the first level that's part of the realm of episteme, true knowledge or understanding. And how dianoia works, it's the same size as the realm of, as the part concerned with belief or conviction, because it makes use of the visible as an image of the intelligible. So what does that mean? Well, I mean, just look at the line on your screen. That's a visible line. That's you've got two segments divided unequally. So the big segment, CE, and is in the same ratio to the smaller segment AC, as CB is to BA. Now, as we talked about, those visible lines, are kind of close to those ratios. This was made with a computer, so it's probably more accurate than the lines I would have drawn on the board, but it's still imperfect. And what we do in thought is move from the visible to use these diagrams as an image to get at the ratios themselves. So when I say that CE is to CA as CB is to BA, that's really not a claim about visible lines. That's a claim about intelligible ratios. So when I say that 4 is to 2 as 8 is to 4, that's not a claim about 8 water bottles or 8 people or 8 of anything visible. Instead, it's a claim about the numbers themselves and the intrinsic relationships they have between them. So that's why it becomes an object of understanding and belongs to the intelligible realm instead of just being perceptible. The idea is in number theory and geometry and all these kinds of mathematics, you're using diagrams and you're using things written down on a page, but what your mind is really getting to and what you're believing, if you're doing math right and successfully, are the intelligible forms behind the diagrams. So Dana asked, is this where a balance might happen? I mean, yeah, this is where you're kind of taking advantage of both. You need to use the perceptible world to help you recall and focus on these things and draw out from them the relevant features. And thought is kind of limited and dependent. So one thing they note is that thought proceeds discursively. It proceeds from step to step in a process, and it has to proceed hypothetically from assumptions. So the way geometry works is you assume what a triangle is and that there are triangles, or you assume what a circle is. This is how Euclid's Elements, the best evidence we have for ancient geometry, proceeds. You define a bunch of things, you assume that they exist and you can draw them, and then you show that the square on the hypotenuse is equal to the squares on the two other sides. And that's what's different between thought and then the highest level you're going to, noesis. In noesis, you use dialectic. You use this kind of back and forth arguing that we've seen in Socrates to question your assumptions and work back to the first principle. So instead of assuming there's a triangle or circle, you start asking, well, why I think there is a triangle? What is it to be a triangle and circle? Which forms do they depend on? And then the idea is if this process of dialectic is ultimately successful, you'll get back to the ultimate first principle, the form of the good, and then there's a claim that if you were to get there, and Socrates doesn't claim that he himself has gotten there, but if you were to get there, then you would be able to get all the forms, see how they all followed from that one form, and then you wouldn't have to proceed hypothetically at all. Instead, if you achieved a grasp on the ultimate, you'd see, you know, get galaxy brain and see how it all fits together. So I think this idea of proceeding hypothetically or non-hypothetically, there's a question about how this relates to Kant. Let me just say briefly. I think that's influential, and Kant very much makes use of that distinction between what's hypothetical versus categorical is sort of a later interpretation of some of the ideas here. But the idea is a lot of our uses of thought, even when we are operating intellectually, like mathematicians or music theory or all these other things, there's still a lot of assumptions behind it. But the ultimate philosopher is the person who's going to be able to unpack all those assumptions, use them as stepping stones back to the ultimate principles, and then see how the ultimate principles fit together. Now, that's the project. Now, in later Platonic dialogue that we're not going to read, a lot of worries come up for that project about whether some of the forms are going to have opposite forms. They're going to have to be both the same as themselves and different from other forms. So here we get kind of this idea of a project and some general description of what it would look like to succeed. But it's not clear whether Plato himself at this time or later thought that this was doable. Now, there are later Platonists who really worked hard to show how these forms did all relate to each other and how they could all come from the one. So I think this is a live project that was taken up by later Platonists, but we just kind of get a sketch here and an indication that this is what philosophy should be doing, but we don't get a worked out system that's defended in the way that some of the later Platonists that we won't have time to read, partly because, well, you have to read the whole system and it's very complicated, but it's sort of a research project going forward.